Lee, thanks so much for jumping onto the security space, mate. I'm very, very impressed that we're doing this internationally. So if you want to give us a quick introduction to yourself and also an introduction to your background as well, because that's an unusual background.
Yeah, so I'm Lee Morton, currently on the beach, but I'm leaving there, going to some pastures new soon. Prior to that, I worked at PZ Cousins, who make products like Carex and Imperial Leather. And then prior to that, I worked for a large organisation called Brammer that nobody's ever heard of. But while I was there, we bought a company for €1 billion. So shows you're not a little company. So yeah, that's me. Head of security over the last 10 years for different companies. And as Nick says, different background. So it's not a fake background. This is actually a real background. So I'm just going to lift up the iPad and just show you. I'm currently near the beach in Mauritius. So a bit of a different kind of scenario.
Perfect. So obviously what we're speaking about today then is all about vendor risk for the next half an hour. Obviously, Lee, I know you've done quite a bit of speaking on this, obviously, at numerous sort of conferences, in the past few months and the upcoming months as well. So we're obviously in safe hands. So when it comes to vendor risk then, just tell me and tell the audience what exactly is vendor risk, just to get us into it then.
Yeah, vendor risk is realistically anybody who's involved in your supply chain, be that business supply chain or even IT supply chain, and the risk that they bring to you. A lot of times organizations focus on the risks that they have themselves, but actually forget about those vendors and the risks that come from having those involved. And that risk is actually getting much larger as we move to more and more cloud environments. So yeah, realistic vendor risk is those risks that are outside your own organization that you must take account of.
And how do you do that then? Because surely you've got a job in itself to look after your own house, and then obviously you deal with numerous different vendors. So therefore, is it not kind of like a risk to use a lot of vendors, but sometimes you might need to use a lot of vendors? So how is that even practical?
Yeah, that 100%. It is a massive risk. The more vendors you have, the more risk you have. But also, realistically, even if you've got one vendor, they will have their own vendor risks. And then as a result, your supply chain risk becomes massive. So examples are Microsoft. Microsoft obviously got hit by large attacks over the last few years. And those then could be attacks that hit you. If they go down, those attacks could hit you. So even if you're having all your infrastructure within Microsoft, you are still under the risks of those vendors. So you're correct. How do you do it? It takes time, and it's got to be a case of you must understand where you are with those people and make sure your contracts are covered. When I started at PZ Cousins, they had a managed service provider that dealt with all their IT systems, and I started there and looked to try to implement security. And unfortunately, the contracts weren't made to suit security. And as a result, lots of changes needed to be done to suit, to make sure that we covered security in that, in with those, and we got the right reporting levels. And that's the kind of thing that I'm seeing a lot of organizations got trouble with, the existing contracts that have been maybe running for quite some time. And nobody's actually ever thought about security in those supply chain contracts and making sure that they are got the reporting levels, first of all, but also understanding what their risks are. So it's a massive minefield, and everybody will have trouble with it.
Yeah, no, and so where do you begin then when it comes to obviously carrying out checks on your vendors? Is there a set process? Does it change per vendor? How does it all work?
Yeah, so what I generally do when I start an organization, make sure we start those links between security teams and the vendors' security teams. Generally, those won't be in place. Start talking to your service delivery managers to make sure that they are involved in those contracts, and make sure that with legal, any kind of new contracts must have security review. That's the priority. First part you need to start implementing. Then you need to look at the actual infrastructure that those companies are using to make sure that they are actually protected, or you're aware of what they're doing. And during my time doing that kind of thing, I've found organizations that you would expect them to have very good security, and they don't, because they are massive. The bigger the entity, the more likely is that they'll miss something. So even large organizations like Wall Street Journal have found their poor security opening up risk. Obviously, we weren't using Wall Street Journal at the time because none of the companies I've worked for used those guys. But as you can imagine, being an entity the size of those guys, you'd expect them to have good security. Now, the problem is their third party had made mistakes, and that then opened up risks to them. So make sure you understand their infrastructure as much as possible. So I generally do reviews using tools like Security Scorecard or other entities. There is some very, very good companies out there that you can deal with, but obviously I don't really want to name them. But anybody who wants to reach out to me, I'm more happy to tell those companies to anybody who wants any information. But realistically, start using those tools to search for vendors, look what technologies they're using, look for their security risks. A lot of these tools, like Security Scorecard, and the reason why I mentioned Security Scorecard is you can get a free account. So put your vendors in there and see how their security is actually positioned. They may be a good organization and get a very high score, or they may actually have things that are publicly available, and you can then use Security Scorecard to say, actually, look, we're looking at using you guys, but we're actually getting reports showing that you have these areas that are at fault, and you can then push that through, and then you can then use your vendor management process to actually say, actually, for us to continue the vendor and the contracts with you guys, you need to get this changed and get this fixed. Yep. And then you start to implement security of your supply chain that way. So yeah, there's plenty of tools to assist you with that, and some are much better than Security Scorecard, but Security Scorecard is a very good start.
Okay. And so if I was looking to infiltrate an organization then, would it always be easier then just to kind of attack the supply chain as opposed to the actual internal house? Or does it not always work like that?
It's both, realistically. A lot of times, security is maybe an afterthought. So an organization's already built out an IT team, and then they've already been implementing IT for a long time, then bring security in afterwards. And security maybe doesn't have a full understanding of what actually is being implemented within the business. So in those scenarios, the risk is actually internal. So when I started at a certain organization, I'm going to say which one, I actually asked them how many domains they have. And they said, oh, we've got somewhere in the region of about 50. And I said, here's my list of 800 that I found that you own. And of these, almost 200 have got the actual, websites and information stored in them. And they were shocked. And the reason why is because there was a lot of systems that were set up away from IT. So there would be, say, maybe a marketing team set it up or a finance team set it up. And those all bring risk into a team. If your security team's not aware of it, therefore it brings risk. So realistically, those could be a target. But that then goes the same for a vendor. So the vendor may have the same scenario where they've got a system that is very well controlled and very well managed by both IT and security. But then they may have a marketing team that's added this over here, or they brought in a tool that allows them to transfer files, like in some of the attacks that have gone on lately. Those kind of things bring in attacks. So there's no actual true answer to your question. Both are at risk, but we should be vetting those organizations the way we would our own systems.
Yeah. And does it work both ways? So if let's say like vendor A gets infiltrated, they get into your organization, can they then get out into like vendor B? Does that make sense?
Yeah, realistically. Yeah. If I was an attacker, obviously I'm an ethical hacker as part of some of my training, but if I was able to compromise one entity and I was able to then jump from that entity to another entity, because realistically that, say we're using a managed service provider who's taking and got admin access on your internal systems, if I then compromise that account, potentially maybe that person's account may actually be an admin on another system and using the same credentials, or could be a case of using the user rights, maybe say a Microsoft account that's being used by your managed service provider. I compromise that account. I then could compromise his system, and then they might actually be using that account on somebody else's system. So I could then propagate from one entity to another, jump around. So the risk is massive. And that's why we should always look at trying to make sure that those rights that we're giving to people are not carte blanche. You don't get admin, you get a controlled admin, and we monitor those access. But a lot of times organizations aren't doing that. They're actually saying it's easy, especially when they outsource everything. It's easy just to give them full admin access, and giving somebody full admin access is probably the worst thing you want to do, because you know, they're highly likely, if it's a small organization, they're probably using the same passwords because they won't have the system securely set up, and then they're using that on another system. One compromise hits another one, and then it's another one.
Yeah. And so how often do you do supply chain checks then? Like, is it every month? Is it every 3, 6 months, 12 months? How often do you do it?
So realistically, I always do it every month, and probably less than that. So what I would do is I would understand the technologies that are being used by ourselves, the technologies that our partners are supporting, and make sure that they're reporting. So any kind of risk that comes from those technologies, I'd immediately add those. And at that point, I do a vendor check to make sure that they've fallen outside, they're within a certain level. But every year, I'll be running a contract with our vendor manager to make sure that the security is right within the contracts and make sure that they're implementing it. So realistically per month, but any kind of drop out of a certain standard would immediately escalate that process to say, okay, you need to revet.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So obviously, talk to me and the audience a little bit about sort of you know, some tools that are available. Is there essentially a way of automating sort of the process of you know vendor risk or anything like that, as opposed to you know putting it down to sort of human checks and everything like that?
Yeah, there's definitely tools in there that'll do it. I won't say, I'm not going to mention the tools in there, but happy to open and mention those in person. But there is tools in there that will actually do that supply chain risk. So in other words, if somebody's actually falls out of a certain standard, or they bring technology in that there's a security risk, they'll automatically send out those emails to those organizations and say, actually, we've found this is a risk, you need to do something. And then that you can then send into your service management system to make sure that a ticket is in place, make sure that people are dealing with it. And then they actually put that as part of your contract. So then you could say, actually, they've fallen out of a certain level, they've got this security risk. Actually, do we need to look at removing this organization from one of our vendors? Or do we look at saying, actually, you're no longer doing this. This is now a chargeable entity because you're not actually of a certain standard. And that's why we need to be in early in our contracts to make sure that we're saying, actually, you've got to keep yourself at a certain scope. And if you're outside that scope, you're then bringing a massive risk to the organization. So there are tools out there that will fully automate that process.
It seems without them tools then that there's quite an over reliance on trust and human behavior, which it's scary in a sense. And so, like, is that true? Is there quite a reliance on trust in this process?
100%. We are reliant on the unknown, is probably the best way of putting it. We don't know what our vendors are using. You know, if we look along the lines of pre-GDPR, if somebody had a data breach, if it's done by their third party, would you even know? Nobody would probably tell you, because they'd probably, I've seen contracts going back pre-GDPR and since, where it's actually stated, if there's a data breach caused by a third party, you're not allowed to tell anyone.
Wow.
So
it just seems so outdated, and like with where we are with like technology and where we are with security as well, that we're still having problems around sort of trust. And I know that human error will always be there, and I will we're sort of I'm taking us more towards an AI versus human angle on this conversation, like, but I am of the argument that we do still need to have human consciousness in security, human initiative and human emotion. But I just think when it comes to vendor risk, the fact that we're relying on trust, I don't know, it just doesn't add up to me.
Yeah, the thing is, it's weird as well, the fact that I've actually been involved in organisations where I'm talking to salespeople who actually don't know they've even had a data breach. So if they don't know that, how on earth are you meant to have those conversations with them? So I did a few years back where I was talking to a supplier, and I actually said, so what actually happened with the data breach and it affecting your internal data? And they went, no, we don't have one of them. And he was like, no, you have. Here's a webpage that shows it. And he was like, oh, we're never told. And that's not, it could even be worse than the fact that because they
Just
don't have it
ignoring
into the, it's the case of brush it underneath the carpet. The mistake has occurred. Let's move on from that. And that's why sometimes for me, I prefer an organisation that puts hands up and says, we've got a problem. This has happened and this is what we've done to fix. Because at least then I know they're actively dealing with it. Was when an organisation just go, oh, keep it quiet. Nobody needs to know. They'll go and report it to the ICO, or I'm not saying they won't do that, but they won't tell their third parties or the people down the supply chain. And therefore, it's like, oh, actually, this organisation's had a breach, but it's not us. We've been hit, but they're all right because they've next level down. But technically, you're not, because that still brings a risk into you.
Yeah, and so where do you sort of stand on the if we did bring AI into it, where we can't literally put in human ignorance or human avoidance? What's your sort of view on that?
Well, where we can't avoid it, not avoid telling people, I think is a great thing. For me, we should be open. If there's a breach, it should be stated that these things have happened, and this is what we've done. We should have that open disclosure. I think whether that's AI or whether it's a person doing it, I don't really care, as long as it gets done. I say with security. So go on, Nick. It sounds like you're asking.
Yeah, no. I was going to ask you a question on that, in the sense of, like, why do you think it's more of a bigger picture thought? Why do you think we ignore, sort of, like, if we did get hit by a vendor, or we need to let a vendor know of a breach? Is it purely, are we going into the business realms, like, oh, we're going to lose money, we're going to lose contracts? Is it going more towards strategic thoughts rather than the actual core issue?
I honestly believe there is that's the reason why. I think it's the honesty is protected by, or the honesty is held back by the business. Businesses are thinking, actually, this is detrimental to us by saying that we've made this mistake. Because, realistically, there's multiple people feel like they're at fault in the event of a data breach. But we all know for well that everybody will have some form of data breach. It's a case of how big it is and how you deal with it is always the way I look at it. I don't have an opinion regarding, I don't have a problem with an organisation that does have a data breach, as long as they've done the right thing. My issue is more the people who sort of hide it or brush under the carpet. And I think that's the issue, is the fact that people just sort of put a narrow vision on and say, actually, look, we don't really want to tell anybody. We've had this problem, but it's sorted now. And that's not really open disclosure. And that's where I think the problem is. People are still working in the blame culture. And that means the fact that we're still not getting all the information. In security, we have two prime examples of where you deal with breaches. One of them is what happened with TalkTalk and their CEO, and how that person went on TV and explained the data breach and talked about what people should do. And everybody knows that person's name more than the name of the company. But then you go and look at North Hydro, and you look at those guys and their data breach. I can't remember the name of the person who were in front on the camera. And the reason why is because the guy did such a good job that I don't need to remember him. I just need to know the name of the company, because I just look back and go, what a great scenario that they did. And the reason why is because they were open, honest, and said the right information at the right time, instead of trying to fix the problem by somebody who's in marketing or somebody who's being that out front person talking about it. They just said, we're going to deal with it, and we'll come back to you at the right time when it's got the right information. And you could clearly see that the person that was actually doing the talk actually understood business, or understood the requirement of the business, and also understood security must be giving the right information at the right time. I think open disclosure is the most important thing. People should state what's happened and what they've done to fix it.
So that was leads very nicely into sort of like pretty much my final question for you, Lee. And it is sort of moving forward then with, you know, vendor risk. As with anything in security, it's never going to be 100%. But what can we do to make vendor risk assessments, you know, more secure moving forward? Because clearly there's got to be a little bit of a flow in there at the moment. So is it literally what you've just said there, trust, open, honesty, or is there anything else that we can add to that?
Well, you add to that the actual implications if an organisation isn't or is not doing the right thing. When a few years back, Cyber Essentials were pushed out into the supply chain, and when I was looking at Brahma, we actually required to be looking towards Cyber Essentials because part of the supply chain for, you know, British government, and also same in Norway for the MOD out there, we had to be a certain level of security and working towards it. And I think that's the major thing. We have to get a process in that says, you know, when we go and buy somebody or we're bringing a contract or bringing a new vendor, that we're constantly assessing them and making sure that they are saying that they're a certain thing. And if they're not, then that then affects that contract. And so we can get those contracts weighed up in such a way, it's going to be hard work. But once those contracts are in place and says, actually, you breach contract by not doing this, not doing that, having this problem, and not dealing with it or not openly responding to an issue and letting us know of it, we can, you know, it's going to be hard work. But once we've done all that in place, things are going to start moving forward. So yeah, the real big thing for me is make sure that we're getting legal involved in those and make sure that contracts are signed up to ensure that in the event of a breach or some kind of thing that impacts an organisation, we've got the rights to vet what's happened, get that information, and then it can affect that, modify that contract as needed.
Perfect. Cool. Lee, thank you so much for jumping onto the security space. I will let you get back to the beach and what looks like probably pina coladas that go with the setting.
Well, I just moved. I originally sat over there a little bit before, but it just started a little bit of rain, so don't expect it to be perfect out here.
A little bit of rain. Grey clouds like usual, mate. But yeah, obviously, as Lee alluded to in the pod, if you've got any questions for him or you want to reach out to him to find out about the tools that he's used, then obviously Lee will be happy to oblige. So I'll put his information below. But once again, buddy, thanks so much for jumping on.
No problem. Thank you all.